Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandham at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. On November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected as the 35th President of the United States of America. This was a tumultuous time with many changes on the horizon. The same could be said about the NFL, as this was the year the AFL started. At the time, this week's guest did not know that the city that he lived in would ultimately mold not only his football life, but also be the end of the line for JFK.
Welcome to the Football History Dude Podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step off the DeLorean, the date is September 24th, 1960, and we're in Dallas, Texas at the Cotton Bowl. We're here to witness the first game for the newly formed Dallas Cowboys. They'd be facing the Pittsburgh Steelers in the first game of what would ultimately become a great rivalry. Now the Cowboys, they were put in Dallas really to compete with Lamar Hunt's Dallas Texans and the newly formed AFL. The fight for Dallas didn't last all that long, but it sure would leave some great stories on the table to write about, which is where this week's guest comes in, John Eisenberg. Now, John is a Baltimore-based sports writer and author, but his love for sports writing really started back in his childhood days back in Dallas, Texas, and he let that show through some of his early books. I mean, in all, he has 10 books, over 3,000 columns, and over 20 writing awards, but the coolest thing for him are some of the historic events that he was able to be a part of. In this episode, we will talk a little bit about each of his football books, with more of an emphasis on the most recent book, The League, how 5 rivals created the NFL and launched a sports empire. Speaking of this book, this is a cool part because John has offered to send an autographed copy to one lucky winner. Now, you got to go ahead and get in on this contest, and the way that you're going to do that is you got to head over to the contest page on the Sports History Network, which is sportshistorynetwork.com/contest. Even if it's past the deadline, which is this Sunday night, there's a good chance that we have another contest open where whenever you're going to listen to this episode, just head over there again to sportshistorynetwork.com/contest. Also, while you're at it, you can go ahead and pick up John's book yourself without even having to wait for the contest. That or the other books, or even learn more about John and his website. To do so, you can go to his dedicated page on the Sports History Network, which is sportshistorynetwork.com/Eisenberg. That's EISENBERG. Also, while you're at it, don't forget to leave a review and subscribe for free to the show by mashing the little subscribe button, your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest out the press episodes, each and every week. But for now, let's get into the interview with John Eisenberg. That's what I like to do, that type of stuff. I like to get them right into it. And, one of the first questions I wanted to ask is, let's go back to Dallas, Texas as a kid, you and your typewriter. How did you even get into sports writing?
Well, I grew up in a household where there were 2 newspapers in Dallas, and a morning paper and a late lamented afternoon paper, which I later worked for, by the way. But so we got the papers, and my parents liked sports, and the newspaper. There's no internet, very little, not as much on TV. I'm not that old, but there was sort of less ways to sort of reference or to dig into the games you liked as a kid when you weren't watching the games. It just wasn't the same. So newspapers was one way. And it was very exciting to me, especially the day after a football game, to read the newspaper. And it was almost like being at the game again. So I think very early on, it just sort of was somehow, I mean, there was no indication I would ever do it, and I did. I had a typewriter and I would play imaginary games in my backyard or in the driveway, and I would come in and type up game stories. But that comes from having read the newspaper and sort of following their footsteps, the writers. So it was just sort of in my blood, I guess.
I think that's so cool when I first saw it on your website, the bio, because as kids, we all create imaginary games, and I don't know why I always go back to remembering when I watched Space Jam and I was pretending I was Michael Jordan with my arms stretched out to throw the ball in the bucket. But I didn't go and then write a story on a typewriter about the recounts of what happened. And that's why I thought it was just so neat that you did that as a young boy, and then growing up, living your dream. And like you said, what was the paper that you worked at for in Dallas there?
The Dallas Times-Herald. I got out of college, and I had written sports in college at the University of Pennsylvania, and I applied to 100 newspapers and got 100 rejections, and then finally caught on at the Dallas Times-Herald, my hometown paper. And next thing I knew, 3 months after graduation, I'm covering the Friday Night Lights there. Just a tremendous job. I mean, probably the best job I ever had, covering high school sports in Dallas in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yeah, that's something that, like you said, you apply to all of these papers across the nation, but then you find out, back at home, your career has taken a path, of course. And let's talk about, what was that transition like going from Dallas to Baltimore?
Well, the situation in Dallas was great. I was covering, I rose through the ranks there, and I did high school sports, and I did SMU. I did the Pony Express, Craig James and Eric Dickerson and Lance McElhenney, that whole thing. And then I was covering the Dallas Mavericks basketball, and all was well. I just got married, but the Baltimore Sun, I knew some people that had gone to work there. They called, they recommended me, and it seemed like a step up for me. And of course, good move, because the Times-Herald folded a few years later. But so it was great. I mean, I was hired into a great job in Baltimore. They just set me loose. Went around the country, really around the world, writing feature stories. I did that for 3 years. And then I got a column when I was 30 years old. So I was a columnist at the Baltimore Sun at age 30. And so that was very hard to turn down. That meant I would be staying there a while. That was a big city paper with major league teams, and I was an opinion writer. So that was a job I kept for many years.
When you say I got a column, what does that even mean, I guess?
What it means was I was a byline writer. And in that day and age, I mean, the newspapers had columnists, opinion writers. It was the most esteemed position on the sports staff. You would go to a game and you could write whatever you wanted. You could write whatever you wanted about anything. And so the sports editor gave me that job when I was 30 years old. And so that was really, that meant you went to the big events. You went all over the place, and you wrote what you thought about it, and you made people happy, you made people sad, you made people angry. It was a really interesting job, and so there was no way I was gonna keep that job for a long time.
Yeah, like you said, you had a lot of autonomy, and you were able to be a writer versus just a recounter of the games and things like that. Going back to your younger days, do you remember one that? I mean, there's so many looking at your website, but one that stuck out in your mind, this was a cool human interest story?
Well, as a columnist, you mean, or just anything? Well, one story, any human interest story, I tell you, going back to my Dallas days, the one I always remember is I discovered Spud. You remember Spud Webb, the basketball player, the little 5'7" kid that won the dunk contest one year at the NBA? And was this famous little kid that wound up playing pro basketball for 12 years. Well, on my high school years, I discovered him playing at a little nowhere high school, and found him and wrote all the first stories about him, and it turned him into a national sensation. And of course, he took it from there. I'd like to say, wound up in the NBA. So that was definitely one. There were lots of them other than that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, picking one favorite, that's like picking a favorite child or something, and that kind of thing. I mean, I was just thinking, you started a long time ago, like you said, the 70s, 80s, before the age of the internet. How did it change for you writing for the paper or whatever you want to say through that transformation?
Into the internet, you mean?
Right. Yeah. Into the digital age. I mean, the whole
Yeah.
information now kind of thing.
Well, it's profoundly changed the newspaper business, needless to say. And it's semi-killed the newspaper business. The internet has. I mean, my industry has struggled mightily. I mean, there's, my old paper, the Baltimore Sun, is a shell of what it was. And that's the case in many cities, unfortunately. I hate it, but it's the case. But in terms of writing, for me, what's really amazing is it didn't change a whole lot because by virtue of getting that column at age 30, I sort of was typecast as, at least in newspapers, as an opinion writer. And so I did that for many years. It didn't really change. One column a day. They wanted, 4 a week or whatever it may be. And actually, I'm still doing that today, all these many, many years later. Now, that's what I do for the Baltimore Ravens is they want columns. They want opinion. They don't want facts. They want opinion. So that column that I got low those many years ago, it's still what I do. And so the internet hasn't changed that much. I mean, I get up in the morning and I write my opinion about something and I turn it in. So it hadn't changed that much.
Being that you write you keep bringing up opinion as far as writing, do you break up like my fandom versus the writing, or is it hard to do that, or how does that work for you?
It's not too hard. I mean, I'm a grew up a Dallas Cowboy fan, big time. I wound up years later going to some Super Bowls where they were playing, and I was pulling for them. It was something that my late father and I shared, so I pulled for them. But I also covered a playoff game where they got killed by, I think it was the Lions, if you can believe it or not. And very good, very good.
The one game, people can't see this. I took my hands up. The one game we can hold our hats on, and killed my whole life.
The Troy Aikman Cowboys, I think, and killed them. And so I gave them a pretty good rip in there. So it's not that hard. All these years later, I mean, I write for the Ravens website. I write about the Ravens. So I mean, they employ me, but they didn't ask me to be a shill. They said, you write what, we're trying to get eyeballs to the site. You have a name in this market. We want you to say what you say. And so, do I want them to win? Sure. But, when things go wrong, you say it. So I've never really had a problem making that distinction.
Yeah. I mean, as not anything I've ever been involved in, as far as writing. I mean, this podcast, everybody that listens to it, they know I'm a massive Detroit Lions fan. That's why I showed you. I think it comes up on basically every episode somehow. And speaking of you and Baltimore, everybody else though knows that Ray Lewis is okay. First of all, Baltimore is my favorite non-Detroit Lions team, and it all was because of Ray Lewis. My high school days, I grew up being a linebacker, and so Ray Lewis is my non-favorite Lions player of all time.
Oh, good.
And speaking of other, dreams and things like that, I mean, I saw that dream to be an author, which you've been a multiple author of many sports, and mostly this talks about football on this podcast. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your NFL books there. And the first, I saw 4 of them. The one, I don't know the timeline of them, but the growing up with the Cowboys in the 60s. I mean, how did it even shape the rest of your life growing up with the Cowboys?
Well, it shaped it a lot. I mean, that book was very interesting. I wrote it in 1997, I believe it came out. I had just turned 40 years old, and to think that the stuff in your life was worthy of history was really a barrier I had to get over, and I wasn't sure that it was. I mean, the stuff that I'd seen as a kid in Dallas, watching the Cowboys before they were America's team for sure, when they were kind of a dirty little, not dirty, but they were a little scruffy little expansion team that grew into something playing at the Cotton Bowl. Was that worthy of a book, sort of a literary endeavor? And I just decided it was. Found a good editor at Simon Schuster and just went for it. And I had read a lot of books. I'd read The Boys of Summer, where I'm not comparing my book to his, Roger Kahn's, but he wrote about being a kid in Brooklyn and going back and seeing these old players. And that's what I thought I would do. I'd been a journalist then for a while. I was going to go and find Don Perkins and Bob Lilly and these guys, and talked to them years later. And it kind of struck me that I had grown up around the same time as the team did, and the city of Dallas. Of course, I experienced the Kennedy assassination. I lived there, and some very poignant years in our country's history. Things happening in Dallas. So I thought there was a lot to write about actually as it came down, and the race. What the Cowboys, a lot of those African American players went through in Dallas in the 1960s was something I was unaware of. It wasn't in the newspapers. So there's just a lot to chew on. And so I, put it all into a book ultimately. Was very happy with that one. I wrote about my family and, dedicated to my parents, and it just came together well. To this day, I still hear from a lot of people about that book. Probably more than just about any of them, because it was so personal.
Yeah, it's a connection to the book that you can't really get in any of the other books. I mean, close enough, I suppose, is the next one I want to talk about, the 10-Gallon War. So you would have been old enough to really kind of remember that, right? During his time, or no?
Not really. That's a book about the 3 years of the AFL-NFL war, when there were suddenly two pro teams in Dallas, the Cowboys and the Texans, who became the Chiefs in '63. And so I was really a little kid. I was 4, 5, and 6 years old.
Oh, okay.
And no, a little too young. But I just approached it again as a journalist. I'd go back and I knew where to go, and I knew the story because, I studied the history, and I knew about the Dallas Texans. And I did bring some personal stuff to that one just because, and my grandfather, who bought all the tickets. I had a news blackout. He went with the Cowboys because the Texans were the up and coming team in the AFL, and the Cowboys were in the established NFL, and he was an establishment man. So it was personal in that sense. So but I brought that to it personally, but mainly it was just a story to tell journalistically.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that, even maybe as you became older and you were able to remember, were there the whole, I remember when there were two teams here, and then you have like two different sides, almost like, I don't know, two different colleges of the same state arguing against each other?
Very much so. And come to find out that a cousin in my family was a closet Texans fan. He went, I didn't even know it. My cousin Jack would go off to these Texan games. It was sort of, not what the rest of the family was doing, but they were younger, they were hipper. And it was very definitely two different. Went and found some Texan fans, and it was a whole side of it that I didn't know. So the Dallas Texans. I mean, Lamar Hunt. His name's on the AFC trophy, and I actually covered him when I went to work at the newspaper in Dallas for soccer. I covered his soccer team, and his phone number was listed, and I used to interview him. Just a great guy, tremendous guy, and an amazing sportsman. And so, he was way, way ahead of his time, needless to say. And he brought the NFL to its knees with that AFL that started. And it's just his story alone is just incredible.
Speaking of incredible stories, I mean, another individual, and around that same time frame, the other book that you wrote before we get into the league, Vince Lombardi. Why did you choose that story for your next book?
The league, you mean
the Vince Lombardi book.
That first season, yes. Well, that is actually one. I had written 4 or 5 books at that point. I was looking for a subject, and actually, I have an agent in New York, and the agent called me, and he was reading. This is the only time this has happened in all these years, and he said he was reading the Wall Street Journal. And he was reading an article about how Bill Parcells was turning around the Cowboys. And buried in that article, 20th paragraph was, it said, this is right there with some of the great turnarounds, including what Vince Lombardi did in Green Bay. And so, of course, David, Marinus had already written an unbelievable biography of Lombardi. No one should ever try to do another biography of Lombardi after David's, which is, so good. But my agent said to me, why don't you just write about that first season? He didn't win. Nobody's written about it. And what happened there when he shows up, this New Yorker in Green Bay, and it was a good idea. And so that's what I did. I went and I own David's biography. I went and checked it out, and there wasn't that much on that 1959 season. I said, I think there's territory there for me to explore. So sure enough, that's what I did. I wrote about how Lombardi, just sort of the gears that were in motion for him to get to Green Bay, and then what he did in the first season, because it's like a prequel to the dynasty, and everything that happened in Green Bay in the 60s was set up by that first year that Lombardi shows up. And when I really dug into it, I couldn't believe it, because all those Hall of Famers were already on the team practically. I mean, Bart Starr, Jim Taylor, Paul Hornung, just, right down the line. I mean, he made some additions, and they were all, I mean, they weren't playing, or they were in a different position. And it was a disaster beforehand. And so to me, it became I've spoken to business groups who have read that book, because it is the story of the power of one. What a strong leader, individual with foresight. How did he do that? Take the same group of guys who were the worst team in the NFL and turn them into champions. I have found that business groups have had a lot of resonance with that. And, he based it on fundamentals, and he used his personnel. He was great at finding where people should be playing. And to me, it was a fascinating story. And so they finished 7 wins, 5 losses, but they won their last 4 games, and you could just see it. Coming together. And so I thoroughly enjoyed that story. It was a great idea by my agent. It was not my idea. I'm a Cowboy fan. I was, the Ice Bowl broke my heart. So it was, I was really kind of going over to the other side, but commerce got the better of me.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing as being a Lions fan. And, I've brought up Packers many times, especially at the very beginning of the league. A lot of my episodes were solo. And of course, you're talking George Halas, you're talking Curly Lambeau, you talk all these other guys in there. I'm like, man, as a Lions fan, this kind of sucks, but It is what it is. They help build the league. And, we talk about your next book, The Men Who Built the League, actually took it to the next level, we'll call it. Let's talk about that book, the main show of the league. The 5 men, who are the 5 men?
Well, the 5 men, I was approached by an editor at Basic Books in New York that said, I want to write a story on early days of pro football. And I said, okay. And he said, great, what's the story? And I said, well, okay, let me think about that. And of course, there've been biographies written about a lot of Bronco Nagurski and a lot of these early football players. And there have been, Leatherheads have been movies, not very good movies. But so the stories had been told. But to me, as I examined it, the most interesting story to me was when you look at the early days of the NFL, bears no resemblance to what it is today. Zero. It was close to a failing enterprise. It started in 1920. There was no money on the table, no fans, no tradition. The games were boring. It was mostly just punting and handing off. And it looked like pro football had no future. It was the far down the pecking order of American sports. So how did we get from there to where we are now, where it is so preeminent and, $15 billion a year in annual revenues and just a amazing cultural sort of touchstone in America? And I zeroed in on, how do we get through those tough years? And I zeroed in on 5 sort of founding fathers who they weren't all there at the very beginning. George Halas of the Bears was the only one. But, the others, by the time in the early 30s, they were all there together. And they're the ones that carried the NFL through these early years, very tough years. And the others are Tim Mara, who started the New York Giants, 1925 for $500 or $2,500, depending on which version of history you believe. Burt Bell, who started the Philadelphia Eagles in 1933 and, borrowed his wife's money to do it, and then wound up being commissioner of the NFL, an incredibly important figure, as it turned out. George Preston Marshall, who started the Redskins when they were the Boston Redskins in 1932, moved into Washington. And in some ways, the first real football hysteria was the Redskins when they moved to Washington. And he's a fascinating figure. He really livened up the NFL, did very important things to get it going. And he's also probably the greatest racist that the league has ever seen. And so every day as I was writing this book, I got up and said thank you that I had George Preston Marshall as a character, because he's fascinating. Some good, some highs, some lows. Great guy to write about. And the last one was Art Rooney, who started the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1933 and owned them until the day he died in the late 80s, and was in many ways the conscience of the NFL for many, many years. Sort of a glue. The Steelers were terrible for years. Nobody believes that now, but they were. But he was a very important figure in league, the sort of the machinations of the league. So how did these five guys work together? They were rivals on the field. They were partners in football, in the business of pro football. How did they work together to survive the early years and set the NFL up to succeed? And that's really what the book's about.
Great, Scott. I'm going to mash this pause button real quick and tell you about a new segment where I'm going to promote another sports history podcast on the Sports History Network, which is the headquarters for your favorite sports yesteryear. This week, we get to hear from Joe Zagorski from Pigskin Past.
Hi, folks. Are you curious about some of the unique players, teams, games, and events of pro football's past? If you are, please check out my bi-weekly podcast, The Pigskin Past. I'm Joe Zagorski, a member of the Pro Football Writers of America and the Pro Football Researchers Association. I've written 3 books about pro football history, and I'm currently writing my 4th. Now, my era of expertise is the 1970s in the NFL. Heck, I even have a Facebook page by that title, and my very first book also has the same title, The NFL in the 1970s. But every now and then I check out a different era, so I might surprise you. Anyway, if you like pro football history, please check out my bi-weekly segment here called The Pigskin Past when you get a chance. I think you'll enjoy it.
All right, let's take another hit of that 1.21 gigawatts and get back into this thing. Yeah, taking it as approach to, like you said, like a business aspect and how do we grow this thing? I mean, what kind of, any kind of interviews, talking to people when you were building the book that stick out to mind to you?
Yeah, this one was more based on sort of research. Of course, obviously the 5 central figures had passed away, but their kids are around, and a lot of them are still, or their grandkids, still running the NFL. The Bears, it was just unbelievable. George Halas's daughter, Virginia McCaskey, owns the Chicago Bears. Still, she's 90. When I interviewed her, she was, I think, 93. She's now 96 or 97 years old, of course, and worth, $3 billion or whatever it is, whatever the Bears are worth, which is a lot. And so she's this, wonderful little, has spent her life in Chicago and had just seen everything, knew everything. And so that was a great interview. She had a lot to say about the early days. She had been there and seen, like, there was a famous championship game that was played in a gym, basically indoors in Chicago, 1932. She was at the game. So
we don't talk about 1932 championship.
Oh, sorry, that's right. Sorry about that. The points Spartans go down. But it was a bad call too. They really did get screwed.
Just like we big Megatron and the catch rule. We like I said, we don't talk about that around here.
Right. Same deal. But so she was there for that. She was an incredible interview. And what was really great was, I later on I went on and I interviewed other people, and people would ask me about the book as I was writing it, and I would say, I interviewed Virginia McCaskey, which is not easily done. And I sort of went through league channels, and the Bears said yes. And people said to me, "That's incredible that you interviewed her. That's like interviewing George Washington's daughter or something like that." And it was really kind of true. I mean, George Halas's daughter was an amazing interview, and I'm very have it on tape. Was a wonderful thing. I was very grateful to her.
Yeah, that's super cool that someone that, like you said, has been there almost the entirety of the league and being able to remember there's just so many things that have changed throughout then. And I wrote down something. I typically ask people, like, give me your Mount Rushmore, but because you have 5, you're kind of cheating. So we'll call it your Fab 5 or something like that.
Okay.
But of your Fab 5, if you could only pick one business decision that group made together that catapulted the league into what it is today, what would you say it is?
It's the draft. The draft fundamentally changed the NFL, and something had to happen. As I studied this history in the early 30s, by the mid 30s, the NFL was still struggling. If you look at there's 32 or 33, there's 8 teams in the league. There's 3 in the New York area, 2 in Chicago, and then there's Green Bay, Portsmouth, and I'm blanking on who the other one is. But I mean, there was a very small footprint. Pro football was barely making it. The Bears were having some success in Chicago. The Giants were drawing fans in New York. It was going okay in some places, but it wasn't gonna. The rich were just getting richer. They were winning. They were dominating. And so Burt Bell, who had started the Eagles, and there was no system for disseminating college talent. I mean, it's just everybody could bid on every player. And so the ones that had money were getting the good players. And so it was just getting worse and worse, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And so Burt Bell had started the Eagles, after that thin footprint I was telling you about. And he couldn't get any players, and he was getting killed week after week on Sundays. And he stood up at a league meeting. He says, "Gentlemen, I'm going to be out of business here. And as a matter of fact, we all may be out of business here soon. If we can't, we gotta figure something out here." And so he came up with the idea of the worst team gets the first pick, and the thing that we're familiar with now. You do it in inverse order of finish. And and really the key moment, I think, in league history was Tim Mara and George Halas, who owned the Bears and the Giants, who were crushing everybody. In that meeting, looked at each other and said, "You're right. You're right." And they voted for it, and they knew that their days of dominance would end eventually. This would level the playing field. And it took a long time. It took like a decade for the playing field really to level, for the draft to work. There were other things involved, but that was the moment. And it all boils down to Burt Bell failed to sign a fullback for Minnesota named Stanley Kostka, who is long forgotten. But when he couldn't get that kid, and the kid played him off of every other team, and he got really mad, and he came up with this idea for the draft. That's the one thing I think that really put the NFL in the right direction.
You mentioned that George Halas and Tim Mara, they voted. Is there a record of, did anybody vote against it?
I don't think so.
Pretty much unanimous.
I think so. And you can look it up. I can't remember. One of the real research tools for me for that book, the league, is in Canton, Ohio. There is a loose leaf binder that's probably 8 inches thick, and it has the official minutes of every league meeting ever, going back to 1920. You can read what people said, the official minutes of everything, what people said. It's unbelievable. And that book never leaves the library they have a nice library in Canton. And I spent several weeks there, and you could hear their voices as you read the minutes from these meetings. It's just fantastic. It was a great thing. And so you can look. I can't remember what the vote there was, but they knew the draft. You know what? If George Halas, and this is practically till the day he died, if George Halas said, "We're doing this," everybody else said, "Okay, great." I mean, he ran the NFL. He was the NFL for so long. And so if he said, "We got to do this," everybody else said, "Oh, well, okay."
I'm kind of jumping myself here because I always ask the question near the end, but if you could go talk to George Halas in any era, like, what would you ask him about? Like, as a reporter, and you're covering a game or whatever, your opinion columnist that you have, go talk to George Halas and have a quick interview. Like, what would you ask him about?
It's such a great question, because the relationship between the press and the players and the coaches was very different. I mean, his brother was an official, and he would bring his brother in to officiate like championship games, and he would bring reporters in as officials, and pay them, and they got good coverage and good calls. So he definitely would not have liked me asking some sort of question like, "Why can't you throw better, George?" Or, what's wrong with your defense? The stories that have become normal in today's media. So whatever question I would have wanted to ask him, I probably wouldn't have gotten it out. I think he would have snapped at me and said, I would have. I mean, there were many, many questions to ask him, and a lot of it had to do with sort of the evolution of the game, He was tremendous on that, but under the radar things that he did. Like he really cleaned up the officiating in the late 30s. The officiating in the NFL was a disaster. The high schools were better. And so he's the one that brought in, sort of professionalized it. And, once he couldn't use his brother anymore, and put in some best practices. And, he did stuff like that. So he knew that it had to happen. So a good question along the lines would have been, when are you going to clean that up? That every game ends with a controversy and the fans rioting and the players and the officials being escorted from the field, which it happened a lot. There were a lot of controversies. What are you going to do about this? Because it was a real problem there in the late 30s and the early 40s, but he addressed it. So, but there certainly would have been a time to ask him that.
So you're saying that the way he is, maybe he'd give you that Papa Bear snarl, and
no question about it. He didn't like that. He didn't like those tough questions. So he's a pretty hilarious figure.
Do they there's been many books on him. Do you know if there's been a movie ever about his life?
I've not seen a movie. I have not. So I'm not sure there has been. His autobiography, Hallis by Hallis, is really good. I used it as a source, and it's got a few, I think exaggerations and a few things, which is what happens. But it was his voice came through. I'll put it that way. The sportswriter that wrote it with him did a really good job.
That's kind of like the victors always tell the stories down the road, and you get to see. So whoever's writing the book gets to tell the story. Yeah.
Well, and with him, it is the history of pro football. I stumbled across an appearance he had made near the end of his life on Capitol Hill, where it was a period of time. I think Al Davis was moving the Raiders, and they were having some issues with what to do with antitrust situation and what with all sports. And a committee meeting was meeting on Capitol Hill, and the NFL, to sort of preserve what they could, brought in George Hallis, and he gave this speech, which basically outlined the history of pro football. It's incredible, and he was the guy to do it. They were six decades in at that point, and he'd seen it all. So, there could be a movie easily.
Oh yeah, I would think that it'd be one of those things where it's almost like you have to have like a TV series where it goes on like a mini series, like HBO type thing. And speaking of stories and favorite stories or what have you, what's the story that you're like, I really want to write this, but I haven't been able to for whatever reason regarding the NFL?
The story that I've thought about writing a lot. There's a couple of them. I've long had in my holster. I've lived in Baltimore for 36 years, but I am a Texan, and I would love to write a biography of Don Meredith. I think it's a fascinating figure. I wrote about him a little bit. He didn't participate in Cotton Bowl Days, my book. He didn't want to, but he did call me when it was over, because I sketched him in that. He did call me when it was over, and it's like the greatest compliment I've ever gotten in my life. He called me one night. My wife and I were eating Chinese food, and he calls and he says, I read your book and you got it right. And I was like brought to my knees practically by him. And so he was if you were in Dallas in the 60s, he was such a fascinating and unique and original figure. And then he goes on to start Monday Night Football, and was just an incredible national figure sort of in television and pro football. And then disappears from the face of the earth, decides he just chucks it all and spends his last 20 years by himself, pretty much. Well, he's married in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's like, what a life this guy had. And I'm just fascinated by him. I would love to write it someday. So we'll see if I get to that one.
Keep that on the horizon and let us know when that one kind of comes forward.
Yeah, that one definitely is on my wish list.
Okay, so speaking of wish lists, and this is the question that I asked to everybody, I'm giving you the virtual keys to my DeLorean right now, all right?
Okay, all right.
You're getting that baby up to 88 miles an hour. You go back and point at any point in NFL history, and you can relive a moment, ask a question, maybe because you spent your days reporting. Let's report on one story. What is it going to be?
Oh, man. Well, I think it would be the championship game. If I could have been at one game, I would like to have been at that Giants Colts overtime game in 1958. The greatest game ever played, so-called. It goes into overtime. It's the last chapter, it's the last scene in my book, The League, because 40 million people are watching it on TV, and the business of surviving and is over. The business of survive, the NFL, which it wasn't, for, believe it or not clear for many years whether it would survive. That was over because 40 million people were watching that game. And it was just such an important game in so many ways. It's really the day the light came on for America, I think, for professional football. And it's modern football, too. It's the football that we would come to know because there was so much running and sort of handing off, and the game itself was evolving. It was really not very interesting for a long time. And then they started to throw the ball. They didn't know really how to throw the ball. I mean, if you go back and look at the statistics, a lot of the passing numbers, they're horrendous. You couldn't believe you'd be fired today, if you're completing 40% of your passes or 35 or whatever. But by 1958, you have Johnny Unitas, just zinging it all over the field to people. And, these 2-minute marches to tie the game and then win the game. So much drama. An amazing football game. I would like to be there. I would love to have covered it. And the coordinators who lost the game for the Giants were Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry. All right, Vince Lombardi was running the offense. Tom Landry's running the defense. They lost. So what a game. And so I would love to have covered that game and talk to Johnny Unitas and say, how in the world did you do that?
Yeah, it's just to think about how many Hall of Famers are on that field, and the coaches, like you said, like don't even realize the coordinators that are involved, even all just so many things. Like when you talk about historical perspective, and then just like you said, the light bulb comes on in America. In my days, like until I started this podcast, I couldn't even fathom that football wasn't like the number one sport. Just because it's like, I can't computate that inside of my brain. Because for me, it's football, and then off-season football and training camp, and then maybe baseball down there somewhere.
Well, baseball was so preeminent, and especially in New York where that game was played. I mean, the Yankees, Brooklyn, the Dodgers. At that point, the Giants. Baseball was everything for decades, and football had no chance for many years. And so they really played a long game, and TV coming in had a lot to do with it. And it's a fascinating story how pro football finally took off. But yeah, there was a long period of time where it was, you really go back in the league when I was reading some of the clips, go back and read the newspapers. It was like pro wrestling. People thought, and the players were looked down upon. It was like, well, if you're going to go play pro football, what's wrong with you? Number one, you must not have anything else to do. Did you go to college? And they were looked down upon. They really were. They had to sort of escape that shadow before the sport could take off.
Yeah, and boy, did that sport take off. And again, we talk about it in the beginning. We have that book, The League, and I'm going to leave that link in the show notes. And everybody, we have that contest that'll be coming out. And are there any last words of wisdom for the fans of the show that you want to give them?
No, other than, I come from an interesting perspective because I'm knee deep in the modern NFL. On a day-to-day basis, I'm around the Baltimore Ravens and Lamar Jackson and run pass option plays. And, just wherever we're going with this offense they're running, and, playing Patrick Mahomes on Monday Night Football, and fascinating stuff. But, I think I love the history. The books that I've written are almost all history. And to me, that it adds to the enjoyment of the game to see where we were, what happened, context, what sort of context is there. And so that's what I've always tried to do with my books, is provide context for what's happening today. And I find that stories to be so rich, so interesting. And the sport has changed a lot. And, by virtue of writing the league, I really sort of learned, I could see the 100-year continuum. And I'm glad that I can see that, that I can see where it started, what it went through, and where it is today. So, you can't really do that unless you dig into the past a little bit. And I for one, maybe I'm a dinosaur or whatever, but I love the history. I love, podcasts like yours. Amen. Because, it's really what gives you context to what's going on today. And in some respects, I do feel the old football was, in some regards better. And maybe the football itself may not have been better, but, the sport, the game, it was these developmental years, the 60s, amazing times. And, I don't think you can ever see more pure football than you will see some of those games in the 60s with Lombardi's Packers against, your Lions. We had some really good teams, and where people are just cracking each other. It's great stuff. So I would always encourage everybody to, check out the past a little bit. You'd be pleased with what you find.
So there you go. Dive a little into some football history. I wonder where you could do that. But seriously, I want to thank John for joining the show and sharing the great stories with us. And he's also graciously given us the opportunity, given you the opportunity, to win an autographed, signed copy of his book, The League. Now, to sign up for your chances to win the book, you can head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/contest. And while you're on the website, take John's advice. Dive into some sports history. We have multiple podcasts up there and other articles for you beyond even what's on the Football History Dude podcast. Like I said at the beginning, we are working to become the headquarters for your favorite sports history year. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.